The podcast industry has become, quite frankly, oversaturated, and with millions of shows already either available or currently in production, new ones need all the help they can get when it comes to standing out from the crowd. Now, podcasting wasn't a thing when US President Teddy Roosevelt was in office, but he was exactly right when he said nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, difficulty. Haha, never met the guy. So to help you out on your quest for greatness, we've rounded up 11 expert tips that are key for boosting podcast growth and driving overall success.
But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Matchmaker FM. If you're a podcaster, it can sometimes be a bit difficult to find guests. Equally, if you're a guest looking for podcasts to appear on, it's not always easy to find them. Thankfully, our sister company, Matchmaker.fm, has an app to do just that. With over 70,000 users, Matchmaker FM is the best place to find, contact, and collaborate with like-minded creatives. Cut out all the time wasters and build a community of world-class content creators. And the best part? You can sign up today for free. So head over to Matchmaker.fm to get started.
What defines a good podcast? Well, the answer, of course, is subjective, because what one person might see as a good podcast, another might not. That being said, there are definitely some grounding qualities that can and should be incorporated into every show that you do. And it's these basic guiding principles that will increase a podcast's chances of success. Now, arguably one of the most important elements is the host's presenting skills, which apply either regardless of, whether you're recording solo or interviewing guests. So it's a well-appreciated skill and sadly not something you'll just pick up overnight. Now, Chris Williamson, host of the hugely popular Modern Wisdom podcast, spoke to us over at podcast.co about his level of dedication and commitment to continually improving as a podcast host.
I mean, one thing that I've done to do my TEDx talk, I hired a speech coach to coach me for my TEDx talk, but he specializes in theater and diction. And that was the thing, that's turning pro. That literally raised whatever genetic predisposition I had to be able to talk a lot. He came in and honed that. It turned out that I had a slight lisp. So I've been doing these very particular S routines on my morning walk. That feels like what a professional would do.
So, number one, an original idea. To give your podcast the best start in life, it needs to be different from the rest, and it needs to offer listeners something that other shows don't. So, having a unique premise will help you stand out in the sea of noise, as good podcasts are built around one idea or concept that they then stick to. Now, being unique can also be interpreted as being niche, and by sticking with a very specific, precise concept or topic, will often deliver you the most loyal of audiences, because you are tickling their fancy in the exact way that they're looking for. Now, want to talk about history? Well, try sticking with a very particular era or person. Want to talk about pop culture? Try appealing to audiences of a very specific TV show or theme. Be confident in what you do and don't try to please everybody. When brainstorming different concepts for your show, make sure you know exactly who your target audience is and, in some cases, who your competition might be. Do your research and gather your data. Now, podcasts that speak directly to their desired listenership are the ones most likely to drive engagement and success. So think about what type of format is best suited to your audience as well. I mean, do you think your audience would prefer an interview podcast, a solo one, a journalistic expose, or something else entirely? Number two, well-structured and planned out episodes. You know what they say about failing to prepare, right? Well, putting a rough episode plan together can make all the difference between a good podcast and one full of awkward blunders. Now, maintaining a solid, consistent structure throughout your episode is key to keeping an audience engaged, especially if this format applies to all of your episodes, such as features or calls to action and when guests make an appearance. Making a bullet point list at least of talking points will do the job, and it really doesn't take that long to do, which makes it all the more worth it when your mind goes completely blank and you can quickly refer to it to get back on track. Number three, plenty of host-to-listener interaction. Taking the time to actually engage with your listeners is key. Almost all successful hosts maintain an active social media presence, so whether you prefer Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, or even LinkedIn, engaging with listeners helps to build a sense of community around your show and keeps them coming back for more. You might want to ask your audience for feedback, reply to comments, give daily updates, or just post behind-the-scenes content. Just be consistent, visibly, helping you become more subjective to listeners who have maybe discovered you from a recent post, a like, a recommend, or even through fault of their unpredictable algorithm. Danielle Bolelli hosts both the Drunken Taoist and History on Fire podcasts, and over the years, Daniel has gone out of his way to respond to as many listener messages as he can. He actually outlined to us his process for replying as efficiently as possible. It's genuinely sad when someone takes the time to reach out and you don't reply. It feels ugly to me. I understand if you get too much, then it's simply not possible, but as much as humanly possible, I would like to avoid that. To make the task less overwhelming, I discipline myself by setting a time limit on it each day. And each day, I respond to as many messages as I can within a 30-minute window and pick up where I left off the next day. There we go. Sounds easy. Number 4. Good storytelling. A brave, rugged rapscallion once told me that there's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. Now, arguably, he was referring to tales of great battles and triumphant rulers, but the same can still be said about your show. After all, good podcasts thrive off good stories. It's as simple as that. And by good stories, we mean ones that are genuinely interesting to listen to, not solely because of the content, but because of the way they're told. Good storytelling will retain listener attention and increase the chances of listeners coming back for more. So it's a high priority skill to begin developing. Fun, entertaining content will always resonate more with listeners than something that's just stiff and bland. And content that makes people laugh or sparks debate is far more likely to be shared on social media. Going back to the point I made before. So when recording, always try to think of ways you could inject life or humour or debate into topics that otherwise may be perceived as dry or boring. As long as you don't sound bored, your listeners won't be. Number 5. Value, and lots of it. Whether your podcast's aim is to educate, inform, or entertain, shows that typically give listeners value are the best ones. So what do you want people to take away from your show? And what are they actually coming to you in the search of? The better you can satisfy their needs and curiosities, the more likely you are to win them over. As the host, you should try to be as entertaining yet informative as you can, and both characteristics work hard hand in hand. If all you ever do is inform and completely neglect your duty to actually entertain, you'll have a hard time reaching and retaining listeners. Remember, people are choosing to spend their free time listening to your show, so it's imperative to not neglect the bigger picture. Tell your tales, spin your facts, of course, but keep it engaging and warrant a return for the next installment. Providing listeners with actionable advice in an engaging way keeps them coming back. So, things like good educational podcasts signpost fans towards things like free tools or real-world examples they can use, and other sources of insightful information, including video content. So if that resonates with your show, then I'd strongly recommend adding any more relevant links into your show notes for each of your episodes. More on that later. Number 6. Regular publishing schedules. If you're serious about podcasting, a consistent release schedule is essential. Fans like to know when they can expect new content, so don't keep them guessing, because if you do, you'll lose a lot of listeners along the way. Decide on a release schedule and stick to it. And the simplest way to begin this is to decide the frequency at which you're publishing episodes. Is it weekly, bi-monthly, monthly perhaps? The frequency doesn't really matter, you just need to make sure that you can sustain it. So be clear about your publishing schedule, whether it's every Wednesday or the 15th of every month. Of course, this decision isn't just down to how spread out you want to deliver new content. You personally have to make sure you can commit time to researching, writing, recording, editing, and marketing this whole thing. So don't promise weekly installments if your current lifestyle can't stick with it. Do you have co-hosts? And if so, how flexible or committed can they be on a regular basis? Settle on a release schedule that works around you. And once you've established that, then your audiences will be prepared and satisfied. However, on the flip side of that, it can inevitably slow down the rate at which you can grow your audiences because you're releasing less regular content. So it's a trade-off that you might want to weigh up before committing to it. Number 7, appropriate and relevant guests. Of course, the bigger the guest is, the harder they can be to book, but you should maintain strict standards here. Only interview guests that truly reflect the quality and integrity of your podcast. You'll have to spend more time pitching, and you'll probably receive quite a few rejections, but booking great guests is a numbers game. So don't let the likely possibility of a guest pushing back stop you from reaching out to as many as you can. If only we had a platform that would help you source great guests for your show. Let me introduce you to Matchmaker.fm. On a related note, if you're producing a podcast with friends, loved ones, or colleagues, you too want to make sure that their voices and attitude are relevant and appropriate for the show you want to put together. So make sure to act equally as strict with them to maintain that level of quality and professionalism you want to portray otherwise. Number 8. An engaging and interesting host. We mentioned this at the outset, but it's worth repeating. All good podcasts need a good host. We could spend quite a lot of time outlining the characteristics of a good podcast host, but to quickly sum it up, here's a list I whipped up a little earlier. Be knowledgeable on and passionate of the podcast's subject matter. Be dedicated to finding the right guests. Be driven to research each guest. Have the ability to make guests and listeners feel comfortable at all times. Be encouraging and respectful towards debates or sensitive topics. And to be able to stay authentic and true to yourself. Oh, and of course, to remain engaging, uplifting, and clear. Goes without saying. Now, if you, the host, can embody the majority of the character traits, then my friend, you're well on the way to becoming a great podcast host. And for more tips on great presenting or interviewing, we actually have a ton of resources about exactly that across our various websites and YouTube channels. Number 9, professional production quality. Look, an awful lot of podcasts are very poorly produced and instantly give off a distinctly amateur vibe. We've all listened to a podcast that sounds like it was recorded in a public toilet, but the good news is that all those amateur hour shows make it actually easier for you to stand out with your well-produced podcast. If you invest in the right equipment and spend the time required to produce high-quality, professional-sounding episodes, it'll instantly be ahead of much of the competition, believe it or not. On the topic of equipment, you don't really need to invest in the most extravagant, newfangled audio equipment available. You can, but it's not always necessary, and by doing that, it can get very, very expensive. But just investing in a good, reputable branded microphone is automatically the best way to get off to a strong start. Ignore your $30 bonus buy special offers from Amazon and instead turn your attention to the likes of Rode, Shure, Logitech. They're just a few, but they're all incredibly focused professional audio experts that, starting from around $100 or so, can make your spare bedroom sound a bit like Howard Stern's studio. Additionally, to produce a good podcast is to invest time into the planning, the editing, and post-production, especially when it comes to your audio quality. Bad audio is always magnified when the listener puts on a pair of earphones, which, let's face it, is almost definitely going to be the main way your audiences will listen to your show. So you need to ensure that you sound delectable on all accounts. For example, we absolutely would not recommend using Apple AirPods to record your show because amongst many reasons, they have notoriously bad bleeding and will never be able to deliver studio quality results. Don't get me wrong, that can be a viable option for your guests, but you as the host, the voice that's going to be heard the majority of the time, you're going to need something better. Number 10, effective podcast SEO. A podcast with a good SEO presence will perform much better than one without. And by that we mean having the likes of an attractive and informative website that can perhaps drive your traffic to it. It's here that you can create a resource hub for all your episode show notes, your transcriptions, social links, and anything else that you deem relevant. If people can discover your previous episodes when searching relevant terms on Google, it gives them a much longer shelf life and can significantly boost audience growth over time. Now, it's not just having a website that can help you become more search engine optimized. Just spreading your presence across all accessible platforms, particularly on social media, is a surefire way of making you more visible online, which is what I mentioned earlier, especially if you are regularly engaging on these said platforms. Ideally, If someone searches for something relating to your podcast, like the topic of it or the name of it perhaps, then the best possible outcome for you would be to have right there on the first page of results a link to your website, a link to your Facebook page, your Instagram, podcast directories, a mobile app perhaps. If there's a social platform out there that you don't have, sign up for it. And if you don't know how to use it, then find out. Making your podcast as widely accessible as possible to enable people to potentially stumble upon your show. And number 11, concise call to actions. Finally, making clear direct calls to actions, or CTAs, during your episodes is a key factor of having a good podcast, and inevitably this can play a big part in your show's growth. Is there something specific you'd like your listeners to do? It might be following you on social media, or signing up for a newsletter, or leaving you a review perhaps. Whatever it is, you want to state it explicitly in your episodes, usually in the intros and outros, and to go about it in a genuine way that doesn't feel like an obvious plea to fly up the Apple Podcast charts, which is why you absolutely don't want to go overboard, as cramming your podcast full of CTAs will make it sound like just one long sales pitch. If people want to get involved, then notify them of the best way to do it. Don't make the command long-winded and convoluted. If you want them to email in their opinions ahead of the next episode or to share a latest post with your friends, then make the action concise, straightforward, and appreciated. And of course, make sure it doesn't just derail the podcast while you're doing it. Incorporating each of these 11 elements into your podcasting strategy is a surefire way of setting your show up for success. Now, note that this guidance isn't an absolute guarantee that your audience numbers will simply explode once you begin introducing or improving on these points, but by focusing on these areas and thus honing your skills on what makes you and your podcast important and engaging, will certainly work towards seeing you reach new podcasting heights.
I've got a question for you. Have you ever dreamed of having your own radio station? Is there a genre of music or a conversation you think is criminally absent from the airwaves? Maybe you just noticed a gap in the market for a radio station based on tortoises? Well, our sister company, Ray.co, has the tools for you to do all of that and more. Even the tortoise thing. With its easy-to-use cloud-based platform, it's never been easier to automate a 24/7 schedule, broadcast live, and even track your listeners. Launch your radio station in minutes and broadcast to potentially thousands of listeners across the world. Sound good? Well, you can start today with a free 7-day trial using the link below. I don't hate it.